The bridge on the River Kwai has often been referred to as one of the greatest war films of all time. Certainly Sir David Lean's epic was the top box office earner in 1957, the year it was released, and it scooped 7 Academy Awards, including Best Film, Best Producer, Best Actor and Best Musical Score. Alec Guinness plays the commander of the British POWs, Lieutenant Colonel Nicholson, who somewhat bizarrely insists on building the best possible bridge for the Japanese as a testament to British engineering and hard work. In the end, a commando unit blow up the bridge as the first Japanese locomotive passes over it. The film is based upon a real bridge that was built by British prisoners of war as part of the Death Railway through the Burmese and Thai jungles. I say based in the very loosest of terms. Yes, there was a bridge over the River Kwai. Yes, it was built by British prisoners of war. And yes, there was a lieutenant colonel in command of those prisoners. However, there were actually 2 bridges, and they crossed a tributary of the River Kwai, not the main river itself. Whilst British prisoners helped build it, the film ignores the thousands of civilians who were also forced to work on the construction, and whose treatment and death rates were even worse than the British. The bridges were put out of action, but only in the last year of the war, and by RAF bombing rather than commandos. And above all, the Lieutenant Colonel was no Japanese sympathiser or turncoat. He was a man who, rather than trying to build the best bridge possible, actually did his best to sabotage the construction. A humble man who refused to speak out against the portrayal of the British commander in the film until urged to by the men who had been prisoners with him and who felt it was a direct attack on his character. This is the story of the Death Railway, the real bridge on the River Kwai, and Lieutenant Colonel Philip Toosey, DSO. Right, let's crack on with the story. During 1941, the Japanese, who were already fighting a war in China, had occupied French Indochina, which is Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, along with Siam, now called Thailand. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, an almost simultaneous offensive was undertaken by the Japanese forces against the British-held colonies of Malaya and Singapore, as well as the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia, and indeed the American-controlled Philippines. In February 1942, the British forces in Singapore surrendered. It was numerically one of the greatest disasters ever to befall the British Army. Nearly 80,000 British, Australian, Indian and local forces suddenly became prisoners of war. Whilst General Percival was surrendering in Singapore, the Japanese now swept into another British colony, Burma, taking them to the borders of India. The challenge for the Japanese fighting in Burma was that reinforcements and materials needed to be shipped up the coast from Singapore, exposing themselves to Allied submarines. They decided upon a plan B, building a railway through 258 miles of mountainous jungle from Thailand into Burma. The challenge, apart from the terrain, was the lack of manpower to undertake such a huge project. Initially, the Japanese drafted local Thais and Burmese for the workforce. Then they urged local civilians in the occupied countries of Southeast Asia to sign up, offering them good pay, $3 a day, and accommodation for their families. It was a smokescreen. Most never received more than a third of the pay, and the housing was little more than a bamboo version of a shanty town with little sanitation or medical support. When even this sugar-coated approach failed, they simply rounded up thousands of civilians from Malaya, Singapore and the Dutch East Indies. In total, the Australian government estimates that anywhere between 180,000 and 250,000 civilians were forced to work on the railway, and that 90,000 died in the process. There was one more source of labour available to the Japanese: the thousands of prisoners of war captured during their sweep through Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies and more recently Burma. In total, 190,000 British and Commonwealth servicemen were held as prisoners of war by the Japanese during the Second World War, which is more than were held by the Germans. 61,000 of them were to work as slave labour on the Burma Railway. Within 3 months of the surrender at Singapore, 3,000 Australian POWs had been moved north through Malaya and into Thailand to start building airfields and other infrastructure to support the railway project. The following month, June 1942, a similar number of British POWs also left Singapore, heading north on a 3-day journey in stifling cattle trucks. Ultimately, 61,000 POWs were to work on the Burma Railway, The vast majority were British, about 30,000. However, there are also 13,000 Australians, 18,000 from the Dutch East Indies, and also 700 American POWs. And of these 61,000 prisoners, 16,000, roughly a quarter, were to die on the railway. Little surprise then that it earned the name the Death Railway. Whilst the Japanese had signed the 1928 Geneva Convention, they'd never ratified it, so the normal protection offered to Allied POWs by the Germans was not what the Japanese gave. Coupled with this, throughout the 1930s, the Japanese instilled in their national culture and especially in their military that anyone who surrendered was beneath contempt. Hence the lack of Japanese willing to surrender until the very last stages of World War II. With that prevailing attitude and no Geneva Convention to adhere to, POWs, including officers, were forced to work on projects that directly supported the Japanese war effort with little medical provision and on starvation rations. Their meagre diet consisted almost entirely of rice with the odd vegetable added, and this reliance on rice led to many prisoners suffering from severe vitamin B deficiency. Even when Red Cross parcels did arrive, their meagre contents were often withheld by the Japanese authorities. And with their attitude that surrender was dishonourable, the Japanese guards were more than happy to hand out sadistic and severe punishments, both physical and mental, to the POWs. Now, let's add all of that to the sheer physical nature of constructing a 258-mile railway through a tropical jungle using the most rudimentary of tools. The whole railway line was built using muscle power. One former POW, man called John Coast, compared it to being a slave building the pyramids in ancient Egypt. In his book about his experiences as a Japanese prisoner, entitled Railroad of Death, published in 1946, Coast recalls that one day he and the other prisoners were forced to lift 88 giant timbers out of the river and then carry them 60 yards before stacking them neatly. Imagine doing that for a full day. Now imagine doing it in the tropical heat, with a small bowl of rice and some vegetables to sustain you. And all the time under the eye of Japanese and Korean guards whose attitude towards you as a person who'd surrendered could result in beatings or worse from the slightest infringement or a mere change of mood. Alongside this slave labour and starvation diet, prisoners had to contend with a hostile environment. Dysentery and malaria were rife, and there were severe outbreaks of cholera in the British camps. These conditions were not helped, in the case of the British POWs, by the fact that the few medical officers who were accompanying the soldiers had little experience of tropical diseases and next to no access to the appropriate medicines. And even if you managed to avoid those killer diseases, you ran the gauntlet of razor-sharp cuts from bamboo, which often turned septic, leg ulcers, lice, dermatitis, and bedbugs. One of the most unpleasant health conditions was scrotal dermatitis, which was known to the prisoners on the Thai-Burma Railway as strawberry balls. Before I go on, if you enjoy my work, then sign up for my free weekly newsletter so you don't miss my latest releases. There's a link in the description. Anyway, back to the story. The work on the railway itself started in September 1942, with parties working from both Burma and Thailand converging on each other. Despite it being called the Burma Railway, 2/3 of it was actually in Thailand. The railway was constructed in sections, with camps consisting of about 1,000 prisoners of war every 5 to 10 miles along the route. Each camp worked on a specific section of the line. The camps themselves consisted of long huts up to about 60 yards in length, constructed of bamboo with open sides. And inside each barrack hut, about 200 men would live and sleep on raised platforms. Not only did the prisoners, both POW and civilians, have to hack their way through nearly 260 miles of mountainous jungle, but in the process they constructed 688 bridges by hand. Bridge 277 was the bridge on the River Kwai. As I mentioned earlier, it was actually constructed over a tributary, but it became so famous as the bridge on the River Kwai that the Thai authorities bent with the wind, and this section of the river was actually renamed in 1960. Work started on the bridge itself in October 1942. Unlike the film, there were actually two bridges, one made of wood and the other of concrete and steel, spanning the 300 metres or 1,000 feet across the river. Initially, the construction team consisted of 1,000 British prisoners of war under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Philip Toosey. Later on, in February 1943, they were joined by 1,000 Dutch POWs and Malay civilians. In the film, the British POWs were also commanded by a lieutenant colonel. In this case, the fictional Lieutenant Colonel Nicholson, played by Alec Guinness. Nicholson effectively collaborated with the Japanese by trying to construct the bridge to the highest standards. He also brought to the attention of the Japanese commander, Colonel Saito, the explosive charges laid by the British commandos. Apart from being the same rank and constructing the real bridge, or bridges, on the River Kwai, that is where the similarities between Nicholson and Toosey end. Philip Toosey was born in Oxton, near Birkenhead in 1904. Denied a place at university by his father, he instead became an apprentice at a Liverpool cotton merchant's. When that business became the victim of the Great Depression, Toosey then joined the Liverpool branch of the private bank Baring Brothers. In his 20s, the rugby-playing Philip Toosey was commissioned in the Territorial Army, serving with the Royal Artillery. By the time the Second World War broke out, he'd risen to the rank of Major. Having accompanied his unit to Belgium, he was evacuated from Dunkirk in 1940. Promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, Toosey was placed in command of the 135th Hearts Yeomanry Field Regiment of the Royal Artillery. It was with the 135th that he was posted in October 1941 to Singapore. Less than 2 months later, the Japanese attacked. During the defence of Singapore, Toosey was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, the DSO, and commanded so effectively that he was ordered to get out to safety before the final phase of the battle. Toosey refused to leave his men, and so became one of the 80,000 POWs taken by the Japanese when the island fell in early 1942. Now in command of the British POW camp at Tamakan near Bridge 277, Toosey was anything but a collaborator. He organised the smuggling of both food and medical supplies into the camp, and also organised the escape of 2 of his men. Unfortunately, the escapees were swiftly captured and bayoneted to death by the Japanese. The Japanese quickly discovered Toosey's involvement in the escape attempt. Sergeant Major Saito, whose name was used for the Japanese commanding officer in the film, delivered a beating to Toosey and forced him to stand to attention for 24 hours. Little did Toosey know at the time that Saito was actually saving his life. The Japanese version of the Gestapo had wanted to execute him, but Saito told them that he would punish the British officer. Despite Saito's punishment, the 2 men actually developed a sort of professional relationship. Toosey's previous experience as a negotiator with the cotton merchant now served him well as he negotiated with Saito for days off for his men, an improvement in some facilities, and the authority to discipline his own men rather than the Japanese doing it. In keeping with his refusal to leave his men at Singapore, Toosey refused to have a separate officers' mess or accommodation in the prison camp either. But most of all, rather than trying to build a solid bridge for the Japanese as Nicholson did in the fictional novel and the film, Lieutenant Colonel Philip Toosey did his best to undermine the effort. He ordered his men to collect termites, which they then placed in the wooden structures on the bridge. He also organised that the concrete for the more solid of the 2 bridges be mixed badly in the hope that it would eventually crumble. Despite his best efforts to quietly sabotage them, the bridges were eventually completed, and in October 1943 the Thai-Burma Railway was finally opened. The completion was marked by the Japanese officer in command of the whole construction project, General Ishida, driving a golden peg into the final piece of track. Ishida had overseen the completion of an incredible engineering project, a railway through 258 miles of mountainous jungle with 688 bridges and a 1,300-foot, 400-metre, viaduct at Wangpo, all constructed using manual labour, completed in just over a year. General Ishida had also overseen the deaths of 16,000 British and Commonwealth POWs and 90,000 civilians. Over 400 for every mile of the track. Or, another way of looking at it, 1 body every 12 feet. The dead POWs were buried in 3 cemeteries, which are cared for by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. The largest, at Kanchanaburi, is the resting place of 7,000 men. After the completion of the railway, somewhere in the region of 10,000 Allied POWs were then sent as slave labourers to Japan itself. Lieutenant Colonel Toosey was posted in command of several other POW camps in Thailand, and he was still there when the war ended in 1945. When he was liberated, he weighed just 7.5 stone. 111 Japanese officers and NCOs were put on trial for war crimes relating to the treatment of both POWs and civilians on the Burma Railway. 32 were found guilty and put to death, including General Ishida. Interestingly, one NCO was spared, thanks to the intervention of a British POW. Philip Toosey spoke up on behalf of Sergeant Major Saito, who was set free. Saito was shocked that Toosey had not borne him a grudge. He later said it profoundly changed his views on life. In the film, the bridge over the River Kwai was destroyed by an Allied commando unit before it could be used. In reality, both bridges were used for well over a year, carrying something like 500,000 tons of supplies to the Japanese front line before being destroyed in 1945. However, their destruction was not via commandos, but via RAF bombing. After the war, the railway in Burma was allowed to return to jungle, although the section in Thailand is still in use, as is the reconstructed concrete and steel bridge built by Toosey's men over the River Kwai. Over 60,000 British and Commonwealth, Dutch and American POWs worked on the Burma or Death Railway. 16,000, 25%, died. 6,600 British, 2,700 Australians, 2,800 Dutch and Indonesian, as well as smaller numbers from New Zealand, India and Canada. Those who returned home rarely talked about their experiences. They carried the physical and mental scars of being Japanese prisoners of war for the rest of their lives. There's a fascinating article in the QJM Medical Journal published by Oxford University Press in 2009, which looked at the health effects of POW captivity on Allied servicemen held by the Japanese. It suggested that up to a third of former POWs suffered from PTSD in later life. The injuries incurred from the physical labour and the beatings by guards resulted in more cases of osteoarthritis than in POWs from other theatres of the war. And there's evidence from Australia that suicides were also higher than the norm. It's hardly surprising that many former POWs found the book and the film un-British, and a slur on Toosey's character in particular. The same humble character who'd refused to leave his men in Singapore did not want to speak out and draw attention to his real role on the River Kwai. But eventually, after pressure from so many of his former comrades, he did write a letter to the press, outlining how his role as camp commander was very different to Alec Guinness's character in the film. After his liberation in 1945, Toosey returned to the northwest of England, where he continued to serve in the TA into the 1950s. Eventually, he became High Sheriff of Lancashire and was knighted. Brigadier Sir Philip Toosey, DSO, died in 1975 and is buried where he was born, at Oxton, near Birkenhead. 10 years later, an elderly Japanese man came to his grave to pay his respects. Former Sergeant Major Saito. He bowed his head and said a short prayer. After the war, he had converted to Christianity, a profound change in his life that was due in no small part to Toosey back in 1945. Now, that is a very different, poignant, and even hopeful ending to this story compared to the film. Thanks for joining me today, and please help me to tell me even more stories from history for less than the price of a coffee a week. In return for your support, you'll get access to exclusive supporters-only episodes, opportunities to join me for live discussions, and a few extra perks too. Click on the links appearing now or in the description. Thanks for joining me today, keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.